All right, we've got Chris Harris from Precision Fuel and Hydration. As I said, since Ironman Hawaii, I really wanted to focus on, well, before going there, I wanted to focus on how to fuel, how to train, how to pace yourself as an endurance athlete, specifically in Kona, hot weather, race pace, it's competitive. And then I met these guys in Kona, the Race Expo, and I saw a lot of people supporting Precision Fuel and Hydration. And Chris Harris is the man to talk to. So, Chris, thanks for coming on the show. And we do have a strobe light show going on if you're watching the video. It's the British style of videos. So, Chris, thanks for coming on and sharing kind of what you guys are doing over there on personalizing protocols, which is what I love to do. There's not one size fits all. So let's talk about who you are and what is Precision Fuel and Hydration.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for inviting me on, Debbie. I didn't have the pleasure of meeting you in Kona. A few of the other members of the team headed over from the UK, but yeah, hopefully be back there next year and we can catch up in person. So I'm one of the sports scientists here at Precision Fuel and Hydration. We're a growing team based out of the south coast of the UK. We have a global presence. We support athletes all over the world. Thankfully, one of our features that I guess came out of the pandemic, the COVID-19 lockdowns, was video calling with customers. It's a great way to chat to people. We offer them free one-to-one consultations with people like myself and other members of our athlete support team, essentially to talk through what pages on the internet might not necessarily be able to discuss in detail with you. And that is your individual needs from a fueling and hydration perspective, typically geared towards endurance performance, including extreme races like the Ironman World Championships in Kona, Hawaii, but also the differences between racing somewhere like Hawaii versus something like the Norseman Extreme Triathlon in Norway, which is the same distance but very, very different conditions. And the same athlete might necessarily do something very, very different from a fuel and hydration perspective. And so, yeah, we basically, delve into each athlete's needs on a one-to-one basis to hopefully help them strive towards a nutrition strategy that can suit their needs.
Yeah, that's so important. I really am passionate about this area. I know I started racing Ironmans in 2001, started going to Kona and competing in Kona 2003 or 2004. And in the beginning of my career racing, not pro, but top age group, I always wanted to win. My age group was my goal. So I was competitive, but I also followed what we would learn about back then of how much to take in when you're training and racing. And on race day, TMI, I would throw up on the whole bike ride. And it just was, I got me to where I am now, what I'm focusing on, how to fuel and personalize your program on fueling and training and what intensity and what fuel source you are using and how much you're sweating and all of that to really know that we are all different. There isn't one size fits all for anything. So that's why I love to, test and not guess and figure out, okay, what works best for me is going to be different than you and all of that. So I appreciate what you guys are doing. But back up real quick. What is the definition of a sports scientist if people aren't familiar with that?
Essentially, I myself studied sports science. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in sport and exercise science, specializing in performance physiology, where essentially I'm interested in the hard wiring and the piping of the human body, and that's what a lot of us do here. But we're also encompassing other areas of sports science in supporting our athletes, whilst it's not always about what goes in versus what goes out, equations, theoretical models. We have communication skills that go alongside. We talk about psychology of sport alongside a lot of our athletes, but also we try our best to sort of delve into the most broad range of subjects. We have our sort of dense knowledge in sort of a few areas, but what we're really interested in doing and why we are sports scientists and not necessarily nutritionists or physiologists, and we try to cover a whole range of the science behind sports performance, is on our, I guess it's sort of summarized on our website where we have a knowledge hub section, which is a huge array of blog posts on, you name it, different aspects of sports performance, from what to put in your body from a fueling and hydration perspective, but also about how to sleep and how to recover from exercise, and
Mhm.
even training styles and coaching methodology. Is a whole range of topics that affect sport, even social life, even the aging process. As I'm sure you've known from speaking to many people on your podcast over the years, is there's always still more stuff to talk about. There's a lot going on when a lot pumps into sports performance. And so we're not trying in any way to be absolute experts in all of those, but as sports scientists, we try and sort of at least have the resources to answer questions and offer advice. And if not, we have the team surrounding us that we can go away and get those answers for those athletes.
Yeah, I agree. I think what I learned early on is that I was a personal trainer full time and got into triathlon coaching and athletes, endurance athletes, running, trail running, and whatever area. But it was really figuring out, okay, how should we train by heart rate and build up our aerobic base and improve our fat oxidation? But then how much should we take in every hour? It varies. Everyone's so different. And that kind of got me into coaching differently as well. What have you learned since you were in college and getting your master's and getting all your education that you don't really learn in school, and how to apply it to endurance athletes? You had any big, we didn't learn that in school? Because I think so much of it's
Oh yeah.
afterwards, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd probably go as far as saying I've learned a lot more outside of university, and my university was fantastic and I loved it and I learned a lot. But from day one, working in the field, working with athletes, you learn more than you could ever imagine from textbooks and research papers. And that is human beings, right? And every human being that you interact with is slightly different, even if the guiding principles are the same person to person or similar person to person. I guess the biggest thing that I learned was that the communication with an athlete is arguably the most important part of the work I do. It's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily what I'm saying, it's how I'm communicating it. It's the manner in which I'm communicating it, and sometimes it's even the platform in which I'm communicating. The reason why emails, they're ever present in our day-to-day professional life, but the reason why we shifted towards more informal communications is because it encourages, better communication. I don't know about you, but starting in a message with "Dear Sir, Madam," or finishing it with "Kind regards, Chris," just never feels like I'm going to open myself up to chat about stuff. Whereas if you pop a WhatsApp video call or a Google Meets or a Teams call just to chat one to one and have informal conversation, and and then sort of we can discuss more things. It's the communication, the back and forth, and the open communication without feeling like there's an expectation for someone to do as you say. You're receiving what the person's saying, and it's a two-way conversation. I think that's probably one of the most beneficial skills that I've learned in this industry is communicating with athletes and being able to hear. As much as everybody comes out of university thinking they know a lot, it's super important to realize that actually if you're not still learning every single day, then you're probably doing something wrong.
Yeah, no, I just turned 53 somehow last week, and I have continued learning. Every year I'm taking some new course, and it's just ongoing education because we learn we're complex individuals, and it's so individual. If you study the microbiome, you study genetics, and you study the effects of sleep and stress on our performance and our recovery and nutrition, what people works, as we said, for someone doesn't work the same for me. So what do you find as precision fueling? Let's talk about the fueling part and then into hydration. What do you like to focus on with working with a new client? They're training for an endurance event. What do we do to get started on figuring out fueling?
Sure. Well, I guess the first place to start is the athletes, a bit about their background, what their goals are, what event they're training for, And then we can sort of get into the weeds of what specifics they should have, the method of delivery of energy or fuel source, and then the logistics of even so much as to how to carry it on there, whether they're cycling, running, or skiing or kayaking or whatever they're doing, and talking into logistics as far as that goes. But
Mhm.
starting very, very broad, basic couple of pointers that'll start gearing us in the right direction are the intensity of the exercise they're aiming to do and the duration. Because the longer and the harder you're trying to exercise for,
Yeah.
the more your body is going to favor things like carbohydrates, or you're going to start crossing the boundary to which you're going to be running out of energy, or at least having to go much, much slower than you'd like in order to sustain the performance. And so
Mhm.
if someone came to us and said that they're simply aiming to do their very first marathon, not simply, a marathon is a big undertaking. I guess we've sort of become a little bit dumb to the idea of marathons, but no, it's a huge undertaking. And if someone was, say, aiming for a 3 hour marathon versus a 6 hour marathon, then even those two things for the same event, even for the same person, you would
Mhm.
necessarily fuel and hydrate quite differently. And I guess while we talk about fueling and hydration separately, because it's easy to do, it's easier to understand that way. It's also important to understand in most endurance events, the longer you go, that the interaction the two have on each other is super important, i.e., one working perfectly without the other means that this one isn't going to necessarily work quite as well. And so
Yeah.
how they integrate into one another, things like carbohydrate based drinks, that suddenly
Mhm.
crosses the bridge between fueling and hydration. But from a fueling perspective, generally speaking, our guidelines, our recommendations are almost cut and paste from the scientific literature and the guidelines surrounding them. We have a
Mhm.
lot of experience both within the team and with people that we deal with on a day-to-day basis as professionals in the area, and we collect large amounts of data from athletes in the field completing these types of events that will help us sort of introspect and essentially guide our advice to athletes. And generally speaking, those guidelines haven't changed too much in the last sort of 5 or 10 years in terms of fueling recommendations, whereby lower intensity, shorter events, you can get away with, not very much to something, and the source of it's relatively unimportant. The sort of 2.5+ hours, realistically, you're going to be needing some carbohydrates, probably somewhere between 30 and 60 grams per hour, the source of which is going to come down to largely personal preference, i.e., solids, semi-solids like gels or sort of slightly more viscous liquids, and then some drinks. So if you're an ultra endurance runner, you're probably not going to be wanting carrying around liters and liters of fluid. And likewise, if you're a cyclist, you may only have 2 or 3 bottles, and that's all you can carry. So the rest might have to come from other sources. And there's also the other, the most important metric to consider is that some people just don't like certain things. You know,
Mhm.
I, for one, I've always got on very, very well with energy gels. I, for some reason, can have them from gun to tape in an Ironman and have no issues. And I have a slight amount of solid foods, like an energy bar or something, and it really upsets my stomach. And so for me, I just choose to steer clear of that. And there's no rhyme nor reason why I should feel like that, but that's just the way I do. And so I adapt. And so plenty of other athletes prefer to lean further away from the high sugar energy gels and tend to get on better with maybe some more real foods, and the use of natural carbohydrates and as a source of energy suits them. And so I guess starting very, very broad, that's where we begin. So event duration, intensity, and their preferences, and then basically use the scientific literature as our backup for how much or how little carbohydrates you should be consuming as their main fuel source. Obviously, focusing solely here on the zoomed in perspective of just the event, nothing necessarily other than a detailed carb load, which thankfully carb loading guidelines themselves haven't actually changed too much in recent years at all, other than maybe the mechanisms in which people do those. So
Mhm.
carbohydrate drinks have become very, very popular, a very easy way to get carbohydrates in. Um, the age-old pasta parties the night before have sort of become a thing of the past. They're not necessarily the best way in order to just make yourself feel full and head to the start line feeling like you're, due in 3 months. It's yeah, there's sort of some
Yeah.
nuance to the pre-fueling as well.
Okay. And so if people are doing a race, but they're just trying to finish, they're probably, you think, find burning more higher levels of fat over carbs than others that are trying to race pace more so and try to finish top in their age group, or
Yeah,
professionals trying to win.
absolutely. Absolutely. I think it was, sort of in the mid 1980s where the sort of crossover model was sort of conceived, whereby there's no point
Yeah.
other than at sleep or at absolute maximal intensity VO2 max where you're burning exclusively carbs or fats. And of course, the better energy source within the body, or the larger energy source, is fats. We have probably nigh on 100,000 calories, even in the most lean individuals, worth of
Mm-hmm.
fats on board. And so, if we can tap into that by getting fitter, becoming more metabolically efficient, then absolutely we want to be able to rely on those. And as we slow down, as you're well aware, the lower the intensity, the more the body simply favors using those fats.
Mm-hmm.
What we tend to find is that a lot of athletes sort of lack that crossover tends to happen quite early. And so in a lot of
Yes.
athletes, and a lot earlier than a lot of people potentially realize, and they're, you know, coming in saying that they're sort of, their marathon pace is at or around their LT1 or fat max or VT1, all these other phrases, and it can become quite confusing. And I guess the underlying notion that at one point you're burning just fats and at one point you're burning just carbohydrates is often misconstrued. And so I guess it's sort of, yes, the lower the intensity beyond a certain point, your body will be favoring fats, but you'll certainly still be ticking along, getting through some carbohydrates, because the exclusive one or the other. I've just realized that my video has paused on a really attractive face. So I hope the video watchers can
There you
see
go.
that. We're back in
Yeah.
action.
Ah.
No, I guess it's sort of trying to help people understand, athletes understand how the body works, and that we are very, very rarely burning one or the other. And if you can train your body to be able to burn fats at a faster intensity, absolutely. And that comes through, a whole host of mechanisms, not least, becoming fitter. Fitter individuals can do that at a higher level. And generally, fitter individuals are more efficient, which means they burn less carbs, but it also means they can operate at a much higher intensity. And so, the difference between someone that is trying to push the limits of human performance, whereby they want to be burning carbs because they want to be working at a really high intensity. That's their motive, that's their goal, and therefore they're training their body to be able to tolerate and absorb that amount of carbohydrates to fuel the amount that they're burning, because we're really inefficient when burning those,
Yeah.
versus someone that is trying to sort of, do 4 or 5 hours of training, whether cycling or running or something, a week. And therefore, chances are, if it's a low enough intensity, the amount of supplementation from fuel of carbohydrates is going to be much, much lower than those other athletes I described.
Yeah. So Chris's video is a little off today, so just enjoy this conversation. It's so funny. So assume someone is training in their, ideally, I'm all about testing and not guessing, but your true zone 2, I've talked about 1,000 times in 12 years. That is a metabolic crossover point where you're starting to see a shift, is the top end of your zone 2 shifting to more carbohydrates. The fat comes down. So metabolic efficiency point, Bob Seibehor calls it that. And then your peak fat burning is your bottom of zone 2. So say you're training in that zone 2, that you're burning more fat than carbohydrates. That is where your prime training spot is as an endurance athlete. What does your company suggest for fueling if you're in your zone 2 training?
Sure. I guess it all really depends on the context of that zone 2 training session. So if that was your only run or ride that you do a week, then the context of that is very different than if that was your 3 or 4 hour zone 2 bike ride in the morning, and then you wanted to do a quality run session in the middle of the afternoon, and then go and do an easy swim in the evening. That zone 2 session, whatever the sort of training purpose of that individual session is, you have to be looking at ahead as to what you want to be able to do in the rest of the day, and what the rest of your day looks like. And if you're finishing that session, even though the majority of your energy may have been coming from fat metabolism, you're still going to have been burning some carbohydrates, some glycogen, and therefore if that length of session is, as I said, several hours, and then you go into the next session and it's designed to be very high quality, high intensity, perhaps where you're aiming to push your body, your glycogen availability is going to become a key determinant of that session, i.e., how much you can tap into. So if you're going into that session depleted from that session earlier, even if it wasn't a very high intense session, the goal of that session should be to maintain to a certain extent the level of glycogen within the body by ingesting small amounts of carbohydrates, and then you can perform much better than that session where you're aiming for high quality than because your level of recovery, your speed of recovery is in part determined by your glycogen availability at the point of finishing the session. And so as I said, if you're fully depleted at that point, or at least, somewhat depleted, regardless of the intensity of the session, you're still going to be burning some carbohydrates. And if you replace none for several hours, you'll likely reach a point where you're feeling quite depleted. Moreover, on that point, there's a huge, huge bank of evidence showing that dietary habits after long zone two sessions can lead people to feeling, when they are feeling particularly depleted, everyone's felt that feeling of sort of bonking at the end of very long endurance sessions, where they become ravenous for sugary foods to sort of try and stock themselves back up quite quickly. And so, like I said, if the context of that session is that it's a 90-minute zone two endurance training session, then a good meal beforehand, a good meal afterwards, you'll likely be absolutely fine. There's no need to be forcing food down your neck, and unless you want it, of course. You can listen to your body in that sense. But yeah, the longer you go, the more training you're aiming to do around it, I guess the more focus there needs to be on something from a fueling perspective coming in during the session.
What is your guidelines at precision fueling and hydration to be carbs per hour? Because I've done Dan Plu's training at NGRIQ. Their research says, no more than 60 grams an hour. A lot of people at Ironman Hawaii at the Race Expo were saying 100 grams an hour. That is, I think, where you need to personalize it so we don't have GI distress. But what are your recommendations for people, kind of a template, I guess, and then tweak and adjust, course correct for an individual's needs?
Sure. I guess if we use something like the Ironman World Championships in Hawaii as a prime example, that race there is a high caliber event where people are unlikely going to that event in order to just cross the finish line. Probably 85+% of people have invested a lot of time. They've qualified at a previous Ironman. They want to sort of give their body the best chance of delivering a fast time. And we see clear correlations between higher doses of carbohydrates and higher energy availability and better performance potential. The reason why it's never as clear cut as more equals better is because, like you said, the clear caveat is GI comfort. And if we imagine sort of high carb intake and low carb intake, not as polar opposites, but as a continuum, whereby for one individual, 70 grams of carbohydrates per hour might be an awful lot. It might be more than they've ever consumed before in their life. Other athletes that we work with, Leon Chevalier is one of our who finished fourth in the pro men's race in Kona this year. He was taking nearly 150 grams of carbohydrate per hour on the run, on the
Wow.
marathon. Now, it also goes without saying, he is one of the fastest runners on the course at that point, and therefore he is only running for 2 hours and 45 minutes or so. And so he is not out there for doing a 5.5 hour marathon, where it would be likely unsustainable to do anywhere near that amount of carbohydrates, nor would it necessarily be necessary, because the longer time spent out there, likely the absolute intensity is lower. The absolute energy requirement for an individual is likely lower, even though the relative intensity is still going to be high. It's not as if Leon's working really hard and someone that does 12 hours for the Ironman is just out there jogging. They're still working incredibly hard. So the relative intensity is still high. But, the Leon is pushing 300 watts ish plus on the bike, and then running at, 6 minute miling for 2 hours, 50 minutes, having already swum, 50-ish minutes for the swim. So the metabolic output of his body is huge. And therefore to somewhat offset that and avoid crossing the finish line completely depleted, He's trained his gut to be able to tolerate large amounts of energy intake, along with large amounts of fluid intake. 'Cause he was, he's very heavy. It's a hot place, so everybody's going to be sweating a lot. His electrolyte losses are higher than most, and so his strategy is possibly on the higher end or the more aggressive end, if you were to look at it that way, than possibly other athletes. But certainly, if you were to analyze the top 10 carbohydrate intakes from the male professionals in Kona, I'd imagine you would see a large trend of sort of north of 100 to 110, some people averaging over 120 grams an hour for the whole race.
Mm.
Whereas generally speaking, the scientific literature has suggested somewhere between 60 and 90 as a recommended range for most people. And that is, of course, a ballpark. They are guidelines, they're guardrails for, you want to sort of get yourself up to 60 grams an hour is probably where most people would see performance benefits, and going less than that, you might be leaving some sort of low-hanging fruit. And then with practice, regularly training, increasing your tolerance to carbohydrates, as well as likely getting fitter, getting faster, getting stronger, your sort of requirements can increase alongside that. We have a sort of gut training protocol that is in one of our blog posts as a recommended
Okay.
resource to go and check out to sort of see how that framework might look. But yeah, not walking out the door and trying to do what Leon Chevalier does in Kona, that's absolutely not recommended for anybody.
Yeah. Well, that's what we hear a lot in more being a fat burning endurance athlete. When you're training, is to train low, race high, and do a little bit more carbohydrates towards a race. But we'll send people the link to learn how to train your gut for taking in those carbs, because I think that's when I take too much, that would react to my gut not so great, and I'd have GI stress. But for others, you're saying when you're racing at a high level, that you're burning majority of your fuel sources coming from carbohydrates, a little bit of fat. But when you're racing at race pace for an endurance event as Ironman, or I don't know, cycling, running that long, but you are burning mostly carbohydrates, but how to take in the right amount for your unique body and your gut, so you're not having vomiting on the bike. Some people seem to do,
Absolutely.
or running.
Absolutely. I guess a sort of we've talked a fair amount, probably guided by you and I being triathletes or ourselves, is about Ironmans and long distance triathlon. But to give another example of how an event differs, we sponsor a female gravel cyclist called Danny
Mm.
Shrewsbury, who recently completed the Badlands 800-kilometer gravel race
Oh.
in Spain. Now that took them, her and her partner did it as a pair, and it took them 53 and a half hours
Mm.
continuous. They only stop to eat and fill up bottles, and the variety of their menu, so to speak, in terms of what they were fueling with, couldn't contrast more than what the guys in Kona at the pointy end of the pro Ironman field are doing.
Yeah.
Likely because of a few things. Flavor fatigue is going to be one of them. If you could find me someone that could have sports nutrition products for 53 hours, I'd probably give them a medal, because there's a reason why we don't have it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. As much as they taste good, and they sort of fuel your body for the requirements. There's going to come a point where you're going for so long, you need other things in those fuel
Yeah.
products. You need vitamins, minerals, some fats, some proteins, in order to sort of sustain your body, not just carbs. Whereas in sort of a 7-8 hour race, most people don't need fats and proteins during that race. Most people will be fine just having the three basics of water, salt, and carbs. That's
Mm-hmm.
the three things that are sort of leaving your body in abundance, and so should be put back in similar proportions. But no, Danny and her partner were eating, well, they were drinking Fanta lemons, they were having sparkling waters, they were having baguettes for carbohydrate, they were having cereal bars, all kinds of a variety of fueling products, still aiming to hit for those, for that specific race and the logistics of what they could carry and find at relative shops. They were aiming for a far less aggressive carb strategy of somewhere between 30 and sort of 60 grams per hour, depending on
Mhm.
the intensity. There would be some sections that were very, very intense, and there would be some sections that would be far less intense. And so they sort of gauged that as they went, and they included some energy gels, some caffeinated gels, some slightly solid. We've got energy chews, which are lethal in the office. You've got a bag of them open, they're gone in a few minutes. Um, but no, there's basically there's no one size fits all, clear as day.
Mhm.
They essentially fueled their body with what they wanted, what they craved, what they were listening to, while still hitting the overhead carbohydrate number.
I didn't look at on this for this topic on your website, but do you do anything with the exogenous ketones during endurance events for people training?
We
Any
don't
research?
ourselves. There's some emerging research. There's some of the companies that sell the ketone products have certainly done lots of research, and I know of a couple of sort of independent studies that are going on at the moment. I'd be intrigued to see the outcome of those. Ketogenic diets have been very popular in years gone by, and the use of ketones certainly seems to have, from talking to a lot of athletes, they're of the opinion of, at the moment, without the sort of scientific rigor behind their use and clear performance benefits, they are of the opinion of, well, if it's not causing me any harm, why wouldn't I? And
Mhm.
so we don't really have any sort of a hard standpoint on those, and it comes down to the individual athlete at that point that some people, and they take a swig of some of those little ketone pots, and they can't stand the taste, and that's enough for them to say, no, I don't care how much this is
Yeah.
going to help, I don't like it. And other people sort of have slotted it in, and when asked whether it makes a difference or not to energy sparing effects or mental clarity, they sort of say, oh yeah, it could do. So
Mhm.
I think it's probably, we'll give it a few more years to bed in, or not, basically, before having any firm opinions
Got it.
on that without
Yeah.
the literature.
Good. Yeah, I know that a lot of the endurance Tour de France cyclists were hearing more about them using ketone shots during their long bike rides. And so, with the summary on the fueling part, is there, what? How do we want to wrap that up and transition into the hydration part? What's your summary
Sure.
on precision fueling?
I guess the summary point is to consider the first two terms that we talked about: the intensity, how hard you're going to be working.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's really, really hard, your body will be favoring carbohydrates as the fuel source, and therefore you should aim to, try and replace them, or at least top them up in order to sustain that. And likewise, it's especially important if you're also trying to go for a really long period of time. The old marathoners hitting the wall at 20 miles, it's almost as clear cut as they come that most of those people are hitting two sort of things. Their energy reserves are becoming depleted because they're trying to run faster than they've ever run before, and their muscles are becoming fatigued to a point where they start, cramping and having fatigue related issues. And so, from a fueling standpoint, you're basically aiming to try and give your body what it needs in order to operate at its best. And I guess it's certainly worth saying nothing more and nothing less than that. What it
Mm-hmm.
needs is what it needs. You don't need to be, smashing 100 grams of carbohydrates, 3 gels an hour to go out for your easy jog, for half an hour. But if you're preparing for a race, it might be beneficial to add a couple of gels into some other training session that don't necessarily need it, in order to simply train your gut to be able to process them, so that when you do need it on race day, you're not doing anything for the very first time. Um, I guess we've got a handy tool, if it's not a shameless plug, for a fuel and hydration planner on our website that's basically like a first line of defense if you're thinking, what do I need to eat and drink if I'm trying to race, some different events. You can put in the distance or duration, you can put in how hard you're going to race, you can put in what sport you're doing. We put in cycling, running, gravel racing, triathlon, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
and a few other subjective questions, and it'll basically summarize the general guidelines as to where to sort of start with some examples. And off the back of that, as I said right at the very beginning of the call, reach out, have a conversation with us, book a video call. We're happy to talk about this sort of stuff, because there is general recommendations in terms of 60 to 90 grams an hour for most endurance sports, but the nuance of each individual sport, as I've just outlined, Leon Chevalier versus Danny Shrewsbury, 130 grams an hour in Kona, Hawaii for an Ironman versus circa 40 grams an hour for 53 hours in the mountains of Spain. So very, very
Mhm.
different.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say, experimenting each person's different, but then there's some questions of men and women have different fueling needs then. But I think it comes down to every person's unique, not just a female versus male.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah, and we see the sort of uh, all ends of both spectrums where we see larger male athletes that aren't able to tolerate particularly high carbohydrate intakes, and then you see smaller female athletes that are able to tolerate huge amounts of carbohydrates, and so there it is as exactly as you said, individual needs rather than gender specific. You can certainly analyze trends within data sets, but yeah, individual needs, and that I guess transitions nicely onto the hydration side of things, which is carbohydrates for what we've talked about for best part of 30 minutes is actually a fairly generic set of recommendations based on the scientific literature, and there's yet to be anything, or there's yet to be much concrete evidence showing that if you're this person, you're this tall, and you weigh this much, then you should have this, versus, if you're this tall, this, gender, and you're doing this, then you should have that amount. Whereas from a hydration standpoint, it is almost entirely unique to you, and certainly the highest risk of just Googling how much should I drink during an Ironman has the potential to have the most severe consequences, because there is nobody that can tell you how much you need other than yourself and some sort of basic testing, because everybody sweats differently, both in terms of how
Mm-hmm.
much they're losing and what's in it, and therefore their individual requirements therefore are highly individual. Some
Mm-hmm.
people sweat huge amounts and have huge volumes of electrolytes lost in their sweat as well, and therefore for them hydration is more of a priority than someone that's potentially losing a lower concentration of electrolytes and potentially less amount of fluid per hour.
So just wrapping up the fueling part, I just want to say that, well, everything on when there's research studies, I really people, when you hear a study, not just look at what the summary is, but who the study was done on. And it's just a good example of talking about all the different research studies that come out and say this or that, but you're not that person that they did the study on. And if, we're talking human studies, but if they're based on rat studies or whatnot. So I always look at like, who are the studies done? What age group? How many people? I mean, there's so much more to it. So when there's new research out, I'm always like, yeah, that's great, but let me test it out myself, because no one is 100% same as myself. Right. So I think we have to
Yeah,
really look at
that's that's
part of
brilliant that
it.
you're able to sort of do your own self experimentation. I guess we do similar things. Most people here in the office are endurance junkies. We're in the sport. We're doing these sorts of things ourselves, but also, it's a common saying that the scientific literature is usually sort of 2 or 3 years behind what's actually happening
Yeah.
in practice, which is kind of
Yeah.
ironic considering the science is what used to inform practice.
Yeah.
And so,
Way
yeah,
behind.
yeah, it's often the case, and so it's yeah, like you said, it's viewing something in context of, yeah, what do they look at? What were they trying to see? Who are they funded by? It's not always being the skeptic in me, but there
Yeah.
are certainly studies that are
Gatorade.
funded by groups that may necessarily be more inclined to find some things or other things, or certainly at least omit to research things. I'm not saying any research is biased in that way, but they're certainly they're looking into specific things that they want answers for, and so plenty of carbohydrate studies pre Asker Ukendrup, to name one author, pre him in the early 2000s, it was just looking at glucose, and yet that is the foundation of a huge amount of our carbohydrate literature, and yet it doesn't consider multiple source carbohydrate, which is commonplace in just about every sports nutrition product you have now. And so, yeah, context is everything behind research studies, and yeah, thankfully we're in a position now where we've got plenty of real world data, real world athletes, and there's plenty of scientific literature. It receives a lot of attention nowadays, thankfully, due to people racing in places like Kona, Hawaii, the Western States 100, ultramarathon. Athletes like that having a higher profile demands more sponsorship and opportunities, and therefore more research gets sort of funneled into the area, which is an exciting place to be, seeing these sorts of studies going on, seeing the limits of human performance, I guess, tested and evaluated to see what's next, or
Yeah,
moreover, what's happened in the last 2 years.
true. Okay, so I'll put it in the show notes because I want to make sure we get to sweating and minerals, but the source of elect or carbohydrates, I'm sure there's more links we can put in the show notes on maltodextrin versus fructose, sucrose, glucose. That's always the big thing. It's like, hey, what type of carbohydrates are people taking in? So we can follow up on that later. But if you have a short, quick answer, you can respond. And then I want to get into sweating because we're running out of time because that's a big topic.
Yeah, I think if we can drop a couple of notes in the links to our blog post
Yeah,
in the show notes, we've got
got that
a
down.
whole blog post deep dive into the scientific literature behind those different transporters of different carbohydrates and the whys, hows, and the whens and the
Yeah,
whys. So yeah,
I'll
let's
add
talk
that.
sweating.
Okay, so sweating, I just was reading something. I couldn't remember where I read it because I want to go back and read it again. But if you are a person that works out and you have white, dried sweat all over you, does that mean you need to eat less salt? Is what the article is about.
So it's an interesting question. It's an age-old question, and essentially there's a largely genetic component to your sweat profile, and that sweat profile has two aspects to it. There's the volume of which your body is losing or producing, and then there's the concentration of minerals and electrolytes within it. And both of those, as I said, are relatively genetically determined, and one of them is relatively stable, one of them varies an awful lot. The stable component is your electrolyte side of things, where you have a set ability to reabsorb electrolytes before they're lost in your sweat. So it comes from a very, very electrolyte rich area in the body, sweat does, and it passes along your sweat glands, and along the way you can reabsorb some of them, and the amount that you lose in your sweat is relatively stable person to person. So you see some people referred to as salty sweaters, where their ability to reabsorb electrolytes is potentially less, and therefore they lose lots more. And some people have lower electrolyte losses, and therefore they're lower salty sweaters because their reabsorbers, the likelihood is they're much better at reabsorbing electrolytes, and so they don't lose as much. So that would therefore inform if you were someone that had a very high concentration of minerals and electrolytes. The most abundant electrolyte found in the blood plasma, which sweat's pulled from, and therefore sweat, is sodium. So you hear people talking about salty sweaters, high sodium sweaters, and electrolytes sort of synonymously. But if you imagine a pie chart of electrolytes found in sweat, and as measured by their conductivity, you'd see a huge proportion of those electrolytes are sodium ions, around 85 to sort of 90%. So
Okay.
relative to things like potassium, magnesium, calcium, and chloride, you are still losing other electrolytes, but in much, much smaller quantities. So if someone's covered in white marks on their kit, it could mean they have a high concentration of electrolytes in their sweat. It could also mean one other thing. That's possibly the most likely thing. But the other thing is that if they're sweating a huge amount of fluid per hour because they're heavy sweaters, their body is very good at offloading heat, or they're creating a lot of heat, or they're in a hot environment, so they're sweating a lot. The volume of fluid loss, even if the concentration sort of we measure it in milligrams per liter or milligrams per 32 ounces for those over the pond, even if the concentration of sweat is not that high, if you lose 2.5, 3 liters in an hour and then it evaporates and dries, there's going to be some salt marks on there because you've net lost a lot of electrolytes just by virtue of losing lots and lots of fluid. And so essentially you can measure both of those two things. What we do know, to sort of loop back to your original question about dietary impact on salt loss, is that acutely you might see a slight variation based on having a very, very salty rich diet for a few days. Your body will soon sort of regulate its way back down to its natural, relatively genetically determined concentration found in sweat. The only thing that might change it slightly, the sweat test that you might have seen our team
Yep.
doing in Kona, is measuring that genetic component of sodium loss. It's measuring your individual electrolyte concentration via a small chemical and electrical impulse on the forearm. that's stimulating a very high sweat rate. So it's making that patch on your skin sweat at a very high rate. And therefore it's giving you sort of your highest possible electrolyte concentration. We know that there is a small link between the amount that you sweat and the concentration of your electrolytes, because as sweat passes through your sweat glands, you have more opportunity to reabsorb if that sweat's flowing slower. So it's not going to change you too much, but basically the sweat test tells you what your moderate to high intensity exercise sweat concentration is. And so essentially, yeah, that's yours for life. Then I've probably had 50 of these sweat tests, doing lots of experiments here at the company, and my score stays very stable between around 1400 milligrams per liter. So fairly salty, and that would be in our sort of high saltiness category. Um, Andy, who's our company founder, he's one of the saltiest sweaters in the office at around 1,800 milligrams per liter. So it simply means that in every liter of sweat that he loses, if you lose a liter of sweat and I lose a liter of sweat and 20 other people in the office lose 1 liter of sweat, he will lose a much higher amount of electrolytes than I or potentially other people with lower concentrations.
Interesting. Now talk about that sweat test, because you're not actually exercising when you do the test. So walk us through how they do that. How do they use that
Sure.
information?
So it's an at-rest test, as you said. Essentially, we put two pilocarpine chemical discs on the inside of your forearm. We put a couple of electrodes on top of those pilocarpine discs. Pilocarpine is essentially a chemical that pulls the same levers in the brain that exercise does in terms of making our body sweat in a very localized area. It's about the size of a pound coin or a quarter. On the inside of the forearm, like I said, stimulates the sweat glands for around 5 minutes. And then we put a small collector device on, because that little patch will continue sweating at a very high rate for around half an hour to 40 minutes. We put a little collector device on that allows the sweat to fill into this collector device, and then essentially run it straight away through our analyzer, which tells us the conductivity of that sweat, which, if you remember from back when I was talking about different conductivities of different electrolytes, we can inform the sodium concentration of your sweat. And which, as I said, doesn't change sort of day to day. You know, if you went from maybe a totally sedentary athlete to a very high performing Olympic athlete, you might see changes, but generally speaking, the concentration doesn't change.
So we always say you don't sweat out water, you sweat out electrolyte. So you guys are actually measuring how much of each electrolyte you're losing. So then there's a equation, I assume, to figure out how much do you replace? It's not one for one, but how do you figure out that electrolyte ratio, and then how do we replace that?
Yeah, so I guess the replacement strategy is where our expertise comes in. You know, it's all well and good knowing the number and getting tested, but if you don't know
Yes.
sort of what that means and the interpretation of that, then it's not very helpful for race day. And
Oh,
yeah,
I say
quite.
that all the time because I do pneumonia metabolism testing, and I can just give you a report, but it means nothing unless you have someone work with you and individualize that data, figure out here's what your action plan is, here's what to do with this number. So that's what you guys are doing with precision hydration part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And essentially, like you said, that it doesn't have to be a one-for-one replacement. And in shorter events and even in cooler conditions where you're not sweating very much, the concentration of your sweat might be extremely high. But if you're not sweating very much in terms of the volume that you lose, then the replacement has to take a much lower priority, because you don't have to, as you said, replace like for like. We can all tolerate some dehydration and some level of electrolyte disturbance that our body will just simply correct for. You know, we don't have to be. There's a reason why after every single training session I had a fairly long swim this morning, and you know I've had some salt in my food, and I've drunk sort of adequately to thirst, and I'm okay. You know, I'm still functioning here at 5 p.m. UK time. We're still all good. But during a race, the goal is to sort of prevent a decline, and so to the best of your ability, the drinks that you're consuming during that race, we would recommend aiming for, if it's sort of 3+ hours or 2.5 to 3+ hours, you're sweating a lot, especially if it's in hot conditions, you want to be aiming for a concentration similar to your sweat. And that's not only to help replenish the fluid and electrolytes that you're sweating, but also we know that there's a clear link between sodium and glucose absorption through the sodium glucose transporters, which can actually help your body retain a little bit of fluid that you're drinking to make sure you're not peeing all the time, and
Mm.
also help with the absorption of some of those carbohydrates that you're taking. And so it essentially, the concentration should be similar to what you're losing, but understanding that you do have some level of freedom there in terms of what your body can tolerate. And yeah, you're certainly not going to notice performance decline because you're 100 milligrams per liter different on your electrolyte intake, that's for sure.
So if you are feeling dehydrated or signs of dehydration, if you took in the wrong electrolytes or not enough electrolytes, it'd be clue if you're peeing all the time. Because I'm curious, if you are dehydrated, seems like you could be peeing all the time. And then if you're getting too much water, you could be peeing all the time. So what do you find with the right clues that your body's going to say, I've had enough, the Goldilocks effect for electrolytes?
Yeah, so honestly, it's sort of, we're talking about sort of one part of the electrolyte and the hydration strategy, when in reality the other part of it is equally as important, and that's the volume of fluid you're consuming.
Mm-hmm.
So similarly to the electrolyte side of things, if you're sweating 1 liter per hour, which for those that don't know, super easy way to measure this, and it's just to
Yeah.
weigh yourself before and after some exercise. And in the metric system, it's really easy to convert one for one, whereby if you lose a kilo, it's equivalent to a liter of sweat. But in the imperial system, if you lose 2.2 pounds of body weight, that's equivalent to around 32 ounces of sweat loss.
Mm.
And roughly what you want to your sort of get a handle on is, at my race intensity on the bike in similar temperatures that I'm going to experience, how much am I sweating? How much weight am I losing through sweat loss? So doing some testing on some easy bike rides, some easy runs, will get you a good picture of how much sweat you're losing. And then if you've had a sweat test, you'll know the concentration of that sweat. So if I've lost 1.5 liters in a 1 hour ride at my target Ironman power, because it's quite hot, that's quite a large amount to lose. And I know that my sweat also has, let's use 1500 milligrams per liter as an example, then I know that for every single kilo of body weight I lose, I'm also losing 1500 milligrams of sodium within that fluid. And so if I were to replace everything, I'd need to drink 1.5 liters and I need to consume 1500 milligrams of sodium per liter. And so that would be what, 250 milligrams. That would be everything out is everything back in. We can all tolerate some dehydration. Most people can tolerate 2 to 4% is probably where the scientific literature has settled on in terms of tolerance of dehydration. 2 to 4% of body weight loss, that is. Where within those realms, so if you sort of finish a race 1% lighter than you started, chances are dehydration hasn't played a particularly important role in detrimenting your performance. If you finish your race 5% lighter than you started, chances are dehydration was impacting your performance in some way. And it's
Yeah.
part of the reason why in hot races like Kona, they weigh every athlete beforehand, and so that if they have to scrape you off the Queen K, because you're one of those that's being particularly unwell or is having issues, they can weigh you and assess how dehydrated is this individual, and therefore what sort of steps do we need to take before getting blood tests and sugar in them. We can sort of make some assessments. And so essentially the goal is put back enough so that you're not getting too dehydrated,
Mhm.
and of a similar concentration to the electrolytes found in your sweat. And that is usually plenty enough for most people. And we see some people that find that they benefit from larger amounts, and some people find they benefit from lower amounts, but the amount is very individual to each person.
Yeah, that's why I love what you guys are doing. So I trained for, whatever, 20 years with different people. You can see people that are super sweaty and salty and just a mess, and others that are not even sweating. And so it is so personalized. And I think it's really interesting that it's not just, to remind people, it's not just sodium you're losing, but there's other electrolytes in there. So you're measuring the sodium And potassium, magnesium, we hear in a lot of electrolyte mixes. Are you adding that into the test, sweat test?
So it's not something that we're measuring in the test, but we know that that genetic makeup of sweat profiles in terms of the proportions of different electrolytes, we know that that is fairly stable with most people. There's going to be some individuals that have, extreme potassium losses due to some genetic variants, but on the whole, most people lose similar proportions, and therefore, regardless of the strength of electrolytes that you're going for, the sodium is the main focus. And if you look at the range of electrolytes that we sell three different strengths: 500 milligrams per liter, 1,000 milligrams per liter, and 1,500 milligrams per liter. That refers to the sodium content, but there is also the other minor electrolytes within there in much smaller proportional amounts, because the notion that you need the same amount of potassium as you do sodium
Yeah.
doesn't make sense when you measure and analyze what's in sweat. We know that you're losing far more sodium, so that just becomes the priority, not the only, but the priority.
Yeah, so interesting. So many other questions, but I know we're running out of time. One other thing to throw in there for swimmers, as I know I swim North San Diego, Solana Beach, and half the time, people are struggling with dehydration, and we get swimming along and you get cramps, muscle cramps swimming. And I think swimming, you don't really realize that you need to hydrate and you need the electrolytes in there. So have you worked with swimmers or master swim or endurance swimming workouts for
Certainly
figuring?
have.
Yeah.
Yeah, we certainly have. We've been fortunate enough to work with a world record holder now in Andy Donaldson, who's an ex-Commonwealth standard swimmer, a Scottish chap who moved to Perth, Australia. Don't blame him, and is doing more open water swim challenges. So he's just set the world record for the fastest swim around Manhattan Island, which is, I think I'm going to misquote it, but I think it's around 47 kilometers, and he did it in just over 5.5 hours. In crazy
Wow.
speeds. It's just under 1 minute 100 pace because he was timing it with the tides. And yeah, needless to say, to fuel that engine that's performing that amount of work requires, plenty of practice. And it can't just be, oh, we'll have a swig of a sports drink, isotonic drink beforehand and then crack on. He's being fed drinks every 15 minutes during that from a boat or a kayak, where the man's ability to consume fluids is, I would urge anybody that's not seen open water swimming feeds to YouTube it. It is remarkable how quickly those humans can put away fluids whilst they're swimming at 1 minute 10, 1 minute 5 per 100 meters, that is.
Yeah.
So we've certainly worked with plenty of athletes like him. We've been fortunate enough to work with an event in Europe called Ultra Swim 33.3, who actually 33.3 is the distance of the English Channel in kilometers, and they split that up into stages throughout a sort of 3 or 4 day period where people can complete the length of the channel, but broken up into sort of 5K here, 6K there, there's a 10K in the middle there. And fueling and hydrating that is absolutely, comes with its challenges. There's, people without support access during that are stuffing gels up their wetsuits. They're putting, flasks in. They're pre-hydrating optimally beforehand, which I won't get into the detail now, but we'll pop the blog post on pre-hydrating in the show notes, so you can have a little look at how you can arrive at the start line hydrated enough, and then making sure they're recovering enough in between, so that they're getting the carbs, the water, the salts, the proteins back in afterwards, to make sure that when they wake up the next day, they're not feeling like their arms are dragging on the floor and they can't lift them above their head.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know there's a lot of endurance swimmers in Solana Beach that do Catalina Island around. And then I just released, we had 2-part interview with Neil Gait, who did the swim in the UK. And I don't know, it was an 11-hour swim that they did or something crazy, 33 miles. But they were just doing fasted and challenging that you don't need as much fuel, but you need those electrolytes. So there's a lot of different people out there trying these ultra swimming events. It's crazy. So we have lots of show notes to add in, links to put in the show notes. So any questions people have, maybe you can send them in to me, and then we can try to do a part 2. So there's so much to get into. And I know people have a lot of questions in this area, especially in ultra endurance events and hot weather climates. you're getting ready for your own race in New Zealand coming up. Is that a hot weather because it's summertime there?
It's such a varied climate in New Zealand
Mm,
in Taupo, and I'm sure someone will correct me on the pronunciation, but it's the best I've got at the moment.
I think that's
But
right. Wow.
some people have had races there at the same time of the year where it's been 28, 29 degrees Celsius, sort of 80 Fahrenheit, and other times it's been 10 or 12, sort of 40 or 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and so
Ooh.
it could be quite varied, but I'm I'm prepared for all. I'm training in the British winter, and so I'm prepared for the cold. But we've also got our heat chamber here at our HQ where I can thankfully do some heat preparations. We test some different protocols. So hopefully got my bases covered.
Oh, great. Well, good luck to you. And we look forward to reading more, and hopefully people read all the articles in the show notes and send in your questions so we can do follow up, because I think it's so important to figure out, the training part we talk about all the time, but how to fuel for that intensity is going to vary for everybody. And then the hydration part with the electrolytes, I think that is so fascinating, and how we can really dial it in to how much based on our sweating. So I appreciate what you guys are doing.
Awesome. Thanks very much for having us on. And yeah, if anybody has any questions that the blog post or the planner doesn't directly answer, then absolutely the link to the video call booking. Maybe we'll get on to a part two. But if you've got any questions that you think it's a silly question, then don't worry. There are no such thing as silly questions, and feel
True.
free to book one of our video calls totally free of charge. 20 minutes, half an hour with one of our experts, and we'll just yeah chat,
Yeah,
fuel and
we can,
hydration.
and we talk anything, peeing, pooping, vomiting, as a functional medicine. I do lab testing, stool testing. You can talk about anything with me. So no question is embarrassing.
Absolutely not.
Awesome. All right. We'll put the links in the show notes. I'll let you go have your evening on a Monday in the UK and enjoy your rest of the day.
Awesome. Thanks very much. Have a great rest of the day too.